All right. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the introduction. I shall speak about two seemingly remote topics that I think nevertheless are connected. That is the latent spaces of machine learning systems, spaces that certain researchers claim to function as world models, and the novel as a literary form of world modeling that, according to philosopher Hans Blumenberg, too claims to be, if not the world, then at least a world. In doing so, I aim to pursue three lines of thought. First, I want to propose a way for the humanities to engage with AI, not merely to think about AI, but to think with it. This means treating the philosophical assumptions embedded in technical systems not solely as targets for critique or correction, but as productive provocations, challenges that prompt us to rethink and reconfigure our own conceptual and aesthetic frameworks. The philosophy instantiated by these systems thus becomes a lens through which foundational ideas can be reconsidered, not by, as it were, exculpating concepts from AI research, but by taking them seriously as heuristic and material concepts. Second, I want to defend a guiding assumption shared by those who see affinities between some version of structuralism and machine learning, namely that these models are indeed structured wholes, and that they should be read in continuity with a certain holistic tradition. Of course, this holism is imperfect, partial, and contingent, but the comparison with the novel can help us specify maybe what kind of whole is at stake. After all, while it is relatively easy to say that latent spaces are structures, it is much harder to answer the question, what is the structure of their structure? Finally, I want to suggest that this comparison between latent spaces and the novel illuminates what kinds of texts we can expect from machine learning systems. For while they undoubtedly produce writing, it is a distinctive form of writing, stylistically and structurally marked, and recognizing this may help us better understand the textual landscape emerging from this techno-semiotic regime. To be sure, what I'm presenting today, the first stab at a new project, is very much a work in progress. I can offer neither a fully developed thesis nor conclusive findings, only a parallel that I believe is worth exploring. More troubling still, my motivation for undertaking this project is largely personal. I can't assume that at all that it will be of interest to you. It arises from my own intertwined literary and academic practice. I mention these things in advance in the hope of keeping any resulting disappointment within reasonable bounds. And yet it is precisely this intersection of theory and practice that is foundational to what follows. For this reason, I will begin by describing my working method, and here a second apology is in order. I'm about to say I quite a bit. But I feel it is important to make transparent how I came to the topic. In the second part, I'll turn to the notion of world models and show its relation to latent spaces. Finally, I will attempt to build a bridge to the novel and ask whether the proliferation of AI-generated fiction marks the emergence of a new textual form. Let me begin with the relationship between theory and practice that brought me to this topic. My theoretical interest operates on two levels. I aim to offer dense, close descriptions of digital cultural phenomena while also reflecting on their implications for the status of language. On the one hand, I seek to understand what is singular, novel, or distinctive about these developments. On the other, I am concerned with how the current reality of technical media may compel us to rethink the conceptual vocabulary long used in the humanities. This is especially true in the domain of so-called artificial intelligence, a field that has always maintained a somewhat fraught relationship with its own theorization. As early as the 1990s, visionary computer scientist, philosopher Philip Ager argued that any humanities discipline engaging seriously with computer science must consider 5 key points: that many ideas in computer science have unacknowledged philosophical origins, that AI research programs operationalize these ideas by rendering them technically actionable, that the challenges such programs encounter often arise from tensions or aporias within the ideas themselves, that this friction is philosophically productive as it renders those aporias visible, and finally, that while the analysis of these issues must take place outside the technical systems, it can nonetheless inform and improve them through critical feedback. In short, Ager writes in an oft-quoted sentence, AI is philosophy underneath. I agree with Ager on all 5 points, but I would place an even greater emphasis on the implication of the 4th. The role of the humanities, I believe, is not merely to refine the foundational assumptions of computer science or to optimize its technical output, as the fifth point might be read to suggest. Rather, technical systems like AI can themselves serve as instruments for interrogating those conceptual assumptions. They allow us to test long-standing ideas against a new technical reality and to revise or expand them where necessary. This is not simply a matter of thinking about AI, but of thinking with it. I would like to illustrate this with an example I explored in my contribution to the anthology Thinking with AI, published this spring, which was itself born from this very premise. In that piece, I brought together the classical concept of ekphrasis, the verbal representation of visual representation, with an analysis of how multimodal AI systems, such as image generators like DALL-E, that translate linguistic prompts into images, challenge and transform established categories in media theory and aesthetics. According to art historian W.J.T. Mitchell, all theories of ekphrasis ultimately align with one of two philosophical positions regarding the relationship between word and image, one hopeful, the other fearful. The hopeful view, captured by Horace's Ut pictura poesis, assumes that language and image are translatable without remainder. The fearful view, exemplified by Lessing's categorical distinction between poetry as a temporal art and painting as a spatial one, posits an unbridgeable gap between the two. Multimodal systems complicate this dichotomy in two important ways. On the one hand, they invert the classic direction of ekphrasis. Rather than using language to describe images, language produces images. The prompt functions as a speech act that brings forth a visual perlocution. I call this operative ekphrasis. On the other hand, and maybe more importantly, these systems suggest a third philosophical position beyond Mitchell's binary. Rather than simply translating between distinct media, they encode, kind of, both language and image in a shared latent space. The result is neither seamless translatability nor strict separation, but a dissolution of the stable identities of image and text themselves. Here, I arrive at a very similar conclusion as Fabian and Leonardo did in their discussion of media collapse, but as it were from a different direction. I'm less interested in the technical system itself, but in the concepts embedded in it. This example shows maybe that technical systems can act as heuristic material concepts. They do not merely implement theoretical frameworks, as Ager had it, but they generate new ones, and something that Lydia also hinted at with regard to Masterman. Their architecture and performance can be used to probe the limits and extend the reach of our conceptual vocabularies, not by assuming these concepts, that these contents are right, but that they can help to find new angles on old problems. Ekphrasis, seen in this light, becomes not just a rhetorical figure, but a technical operation and ultimately a proposition about the ontological status of image and text. If AI can be said to be philosophy underneath, as this example suggests, it is also aesthetics underneath. From the photographic as the criterion for what a good image is, to the M-dash as structuring device for generated rhetoric, aesthetic norms abound in machine learning systems. But in order to uncover these norms embedded in the material concepts these systems instantiate, I believe it is essential to engage with them in a hands-on, practical way. And here I'm very much in agreement with Etienne. This brings me to the second strand of my work alongside theory, namely aesthetic practice. For over 15 years, I've been working as an author of generative digital literature. Before the advent of today's large language models, I used relatively simple tools to create poetic texts, short Python scripts, n-gram lists, or collocation surface in literary corpora or other text I found online. The method behind these texts was exclusively rule-based, allowing me to formulate and enact strict conceptual constraints. Language models, by contrast, operate statistically and therefore demand a different kind of engagement. Despite certain reservations I still have about the aesthetic potential of these models, and after first having experimented with poetry, I did sit down in 2023 and wrote a novel using a self-trained LLM. Whoops. The project was inspired by a claim made by a literary scholar, Angus Fletcher, that AI systems will never be capable of true narration because they rely on statistical correlation rather than understanding of causation. Narratives, the argument goes, are chains of causally linked events. a structure that machine learning might mimic through surface-level patterning, but can never truly comprehend. No matter how one feels about this claim, it is an example of aesthetics underneath, or perhaps more precisely, of the claim of its structural deficiency. To explore this further, I used GPT-J, a small open-source language model roughly equivalent to the size of GPT-3, the predecessor of today's ChatGPT. Rather than working with the base model, which already exhibits a high degree of linguistic fluency, I subjected it to an additional step of fine-tuning. This process allows a model to acquire a distinct voice by briefly training it on a curated set of texts. In my case, I used 4 German language novels that are all about somewhat the contemporary relation to digital life. With a customized model that emerged from this process, I produced a novel not through dialogic prompting, as one would with ChatGPT, but before any secondary refinement like reinforcement learning via iterative sentence completion, the core mechanism of all language models' next token prediction. The resulting work, titled Berlin, Miami, turned out to be more linguistically intricate and in many places more entertaining than I had expected. It is certainly not a conventional novel, certainly not a conventionally good one, but it's also not an utter failure, at least not for readers familiar with and receptive to the frustrations of experimental literature. The model generated a cast of strange and sometimes compelling characters, including the enigmatic Jawling and his murderous foil, the Pondhead. The novel tells of Miami succumbing to sinister life viruses, while Berlin is infiltrated by the mysterious agents of air. It relates an event called The Difference and a subversive group of friends who plan to, quote, overthrow the government, switch to a knowledge democracy, and scrape away and shatter the lie. Depending on your tolerance for nonsense, I recommend the novel, which will appear in English in translation next year, for your consideration. Yet while its motifs and characters can in many cases be traced back to the training data, so the individual parts are, as it were, still visible, even if their distribution has been dissolved in statistics, the whole is marked by a peculiar, even uncanny disjointedness. On a narrative level, the book seems to confirm Angus Fletcher's thesis. The logical and causal coherence of the story is clearly broken. The plot goes nowhere, there's no narrative arc, logical inconsistencies, contradictions, and temporal discontinuities abound. Character psychology is hinted at but remains undeveloped, and yet the text remains legible largely because of the reader's interpretive labor, filling in gaps, Leerstellen, as Wolfgang Iser calls it, smoothing out inconsistencies, supplying motives, and so on, just as one does with any literary text. It is precisely this incomplete coherence that makes Berlin, Miami such an interesting boundary object, at least for me. At once a technical artifact and an aesthetic construction, it becomes itself a material concept whose makeup and effects demand a certain theoretical interpretation. For even if the narrative does not really get going, the text gives a somewhat clearer indication of what its world looks like. As my brief summary of the book shows, it is determined more by things, people, and places rather than by actions or developments. This world, too, that is certain, is not fully coherent in itself and exhibits contradictions and inconsistencies. But this lack is not absolute. The text hangs together somehow, just not strongly. This other kind of coherence, which I would like to call a weak force, enables the reader to project meaning and generate sense despite everything, albeit a fragile, provisional, and open one. If we accept this premise for a moment, it is this kind of, pardon the term, worldness, or if you know a better translation for Welthaftigkeit in German, let me know, that justifies calling it a novel rather than a completely unstructured, random text, regardless of whether it has anything resembling a narrative. It is precisely this worldness that I want to explore in the remainder of this presentation, the extent to which both novel and model instantiate worlds or fail to do so. In this process, I aim to read AI alongside the novel and the novel alongside AI, treating both as heuristic and material concepts. It is here that I want to bring in my theoretical lodestar for this talk, Hans Blumenberg. Best known as a theorist of secularization and metaphor, he also wrote a good deal about aesthetics. One of his most important contributions in this area, made in the context of the German research colloquium Poetics and Hermeneutics in the 1960s, is the essay The Concept of Reality and the Possibility of the Novel. In it, Blumenberg makes a rather involved claim about literary form and historical consciousness. Every epoch, he argues, possesses a specific way of conceiving not reality's content, but its form, its structure, the epistemic conditions under which something is recognized as real. And in a way, this is a historicization of Husserl's world horizon idea. He refers to this as the epoch's operative concept of reality. Blumenberg, it should be noted, offers no social theory to speak of. But the leap from these concepts of reality to a notion of ideology, for instance, is a short one. And it doesn't matter if you use Stuart Hall here or maybe a version of Jameson. Antiquity, he claims, conceived of reality as an instantaneously evident truth revealed in a flash, like the blinding light of the agathon in Plato's allegory of the sun. The Middle Ages, by contrast, understood reality as guaranteed, with God himself vouching for the world's truth. For Blumenberg, Descartes' proof of the external world marks him the last truly medieval thinker rather than the first modern one. The modern age, according to Blumenberg, abandons both the immediate and the divinely mediated concepts of reality. Instead, it embraces an idea of reality as a realized context, a continuous nexus of relations without ultimate ground, always susceptible to rupture. It is, as Leibniz argued against Descartes, like a dream from which one might always awaken. As a result, Blumenberg writes, quote, "Reality presents itself now as ever before as a sort of text, which takes on its particular form by obeying certain rules of internal consistency. Reality is, for the modern age, a context." Now, for Blumenberg, the novel is distinctly modern in that it mirrors this concept of reality. It is also a continuous context, to be realized in time or in the sum of different perspectives that, taken together, produce a whole. Of course, this implies that narrative is the only means by which such a context can be unfolded. But Blumenberg's interest lies not in narrative structure per se, but in the novel's world structure, in its worldness as such. For Blumenberg, then, the novel does not operate mimetically at the level of substance, as a mere fiction of reality, but at the level of structure, quote, as a fiction of the reality of realities. In this sense, the novel exemplifies the ambition of modern art, which, as Blumenberg puts it, reminiscent of Nelson Goodman, is, quote, not merely to represent objects of the world, or even to imitate the world, but to actualize a world. A world, nothing less, is the theme and postulate of the novel. Yet novels are not alone in constructing world models. AI research lays claim to the same capacity, or has historically. As Blumenberg delivered his lecture in 1963, classical AI was grappling with the brittleness of its explicitly programmed systems, a struggle that sharply contrasts with today's implicitly operating technologies, such as large language models, the very kind I used to generate Berlin, Miami. If both classical AI and the novel seek to construct worlds, what happens when these forms converge in contemporary language models? What kinds of worlds do they produce? And does this convergence, or perhaps this tension, signal the emergence of a new textual form, one that will come to define synthetic writing as it becomes an increasingly common feature of our literary landscape? In computer science, a world model is a structured internal representation of the relevant external world, consisting of objects, properties, and their relationships, that enables a system to draw conclusions, make deductions, and plan actions. I will ignore a lot of the kind of complex history of the term model. I'm aware that there's a lot going on here. I try to focus on a very brief précis of that history in computer science. Such models promised to make AI systems less brittle by reducing misinterpretation and improving their capacity to handle ambiguity. This story begins in the 1960s, rooted not in literary concerns, but in the technical challenge of resolving semantic ambiguity. A classic example of such brittleness that world models were eventually meant to resolve emerged from the first great controversy in machine translation. In 1960, philosopher Yehoshua Bar Hillel argued against the possibility of, quote, fully automated high-quality translation. His research was prescient. Computers would need more than linguistic rules. They would require knowledge of the world's structure itself to resolve ambiguous statements. And while his focus was machine translation, not AI per se, his argument became a much-cited reference in the field. His example was the sentence that has become a kind of catchphrase in the history of AI, the box is in the pen, or was in the pen. The word pen has at least two meanings in English, a writing instrument or a playpen for children. Based on our everyday knowledge about boxes and writing tools, we can easily infer that the sentence refers to the playpen. But as Bajohr pointed out, computers, unlike humans, lack this kind of background knowledge. The world model needed to resolve such ambiguities in principle. The concept of the world model predates the computer itself, though. British psychologist and proto-cybernetician, I guess, Kenneth Craig introduced it as early as 1943 through his idea of a mental model, the notion that the brain operates with an internal model of the world. Craig's work proved instrumental not only in founding cognitive science and displacing behaviorism, although not directly, but also in laying the theoretical foundation for some of artificial intelligence's best-held beliefs. In his book, The Nature of Explanation, Craig proposed that the mind constructs internal models of external reality, allowing organisms to anticipate and reason about future events. While he did not draw a direct connection to digital computers, still in their infancy, his ideas later influenced the view of both brains and computers as symbol processing systems engaged in world modeling. According to Craig's thesis, an organism does more than merely react to stimuli. It anticipates future states of the world by internally constructing a model that is structurally similar to the external world. Within this model, hypothetical actions can be rehearsed on a small scale before being enacted in reality. World models, in this sense, are instrumental abstractions that enable cognitive systems to act with foresight, hypothetically and purposefully. This idea, a world in the mind, as a structured representation of the world outside, subsequently became a fundamental motif of AI research, invoked wherever symbol processing system reached the limits of mere rule application, as in Bajohr's ambiguity problem. An early and prominent attempt to reduce ambiguity, which you all know, through the use of world models, was Terry Winograd's Sherdlu from 1971, which operated in an artificial microworld. This consisted of a three-dimensional space with blocks that users could manipulate using natural language commands, such as pick up the red block or put it on the green cube, etc., and ask questions. I couldn't find a better screen grabber with this. To understand such instructions, the system required more than grammatical analysis, or so the argument went. It needed a model of the world to which this language referred. The relationship between objects, their properties, possible actions, and their consequences. Sherdlu thus embodied a miniature world model, an early operational example of how an internal representation of object relations could support linguistic understanding, echoing what Clark had earlier described as a mental model. Winograd too gives an example. If the system encountered the sentence, "I rode down the street in my car," the parser would reject "in my car" as a modifier of street because, quote, "the semantic evaluation which guides parsing can include general knowledge, namely cars don't contain streets." Cars don't contain streets, just as pens do not contain boxes. Such explicit world models were, for Winograd, what humans use for ambiguity resolution, and therefore what computers should process as well. Sherdlu succeeded brilliantly within its domain, a block world, but only there. As soon as the area expanded, this approach had the old brittleness return. Stuart Dreyfus, in his Heidegger-inspired critique of AI, argued in 1972 that world models were unnecessary. Human intelligence, he contended, is not based on manipulating symbolic representations of an imagined world, but on bodily situated being in the world, or as he called it, being in a situation characterized by implicit practical knowledge. The attempt to explicitly formalize all relevant aspects of the world in a model underestimates the context dependency, the ambiguity, and the openness of human experience. The limits of Sherdlu therefore mark not merely technical constraints, but a categorical error in understanding intelligence itself. The world in which we live and act cannot be fully modeled. It is always already understood before any modeling begins. Nevertheless, the attempt persisted. In his 74 article, A Framework for Representing Knowledge, Marvin Minsky proposed what he called frames, a data structure designed to organize knowledge in substructures representing what he called stereotyped situations. Influenced by semantic networks as part of structure-based knowledge representation, frames assembled facts about objects and event types into large taxonomic hierarchies with inheritance of properties from more general to more specific frames. They served as a primary data structure in AI frame languages for knowledge representation and reasoning. And even today, frames remain in use within some AI research, even if rarely, in involved or hybrid forms, especially in areas like knowledge graphs, ontology-based systems, and certain AI subfields that blend symbolic reason with statistical learning. A reorientation in AI theory and architecture began in the 1980s, influenced by Hubert Dreyfus's critique of the symbolic AI. Rodney Brooks proposed a radical alternative. Rather than relying on internal world models, intelligent systems should engage directly with their environments. When we examine very simple level intelligence, we find that explicit representations and models of the world simply get in the way. It turns out to be better to use the world as its own model, and that is often abridged in the kind of slogan, the world is its own best model. Brooks' behavior-based robotics marked a decisive break from the explicit approaches of the 1970s, emphasizing embodied intelligence and decentralized reactive modules. In this view, world models were not just unnecessary, they were seen as obstacles, too slow, too brittle, and too detached from, ironically, the real world itself. Now, a world model is explicitly created in symbolic AI. It consists of formally represented facts, rules, and relations that the system knows about the world. In the literary text, especially in novel, this is of course fundamentally different. Here, worlds are usually structured implicitly. They are not created through exhaustive description alone, but by drawing on what is assumed to be known about the world by the reader. The text is, as Umberto Eco calls it, a presupposition machine that develops its power precisely by relying on the recipient's prior knowledge about without spelling out every detail. Only when this implicit knowledge of the world is disrupted through deviation from everyday norms, historical differences, or counterfactual estrangement does it become thematized. This explains why reading historical texts can be challenging. The shared knowledge of the world on which these are based has been lost to us. And of course, it is also a problem with any kind of text reading. It also explains why world building occupies so much space in science fiction novels in particular. The knowledge of the world that can be tacitly assumed in the realistic novel must first be created here. With the rise of the connectionist paradigm, a new form of representation emerged, not explicit symbols, but distributed patterns of activation in neural networks. This sub-symbolic architecture continues to underlie today's large language models. I don't need to say this. Does not rely on hand-coded rules, but learns from data by capturing statistical regularities. And these regularities are encoded in high-dimensional spaces known as latent spaces. Latent spaces ranging from static word embeddings like word2vec to the large multimodal contextual embeddings of contemporary models. Yeah, it's okay. We'll be done in a second. Underlie most modern machine learning systems. Embeddings are the representations, latent spaces is the abstract space in which these embeddings live, as it were. And I'm grateful to the earlier speakers who have already explained these concepts far more clearly than I could, so I will simply gesture towards their accounts. Instead, I would like to highlight just a few key aspects. First, latent spaces, whether they encode pixel values, tokens, or any other form of data, can be understood both as a form of compression and as a process of abstraction, as Fabian and Leonardo pointed out. Both operations entail a kind of structuring. These structures are geometrically tangible. They capture latent patterns, salient features, and underlying attributes of the original data. Meaning, however limited it might be, thus emerges from the topology of the vector space itself. In this way, latent spaces, in contrast to earlier approaches based on explicit symbolic representation, such as the world models I mentioned, have been seen by many observers as embodying a structuralist conception of language. And I will return to this point shortly. Second, latent spaces are generative and potential in nature, owing to their vector-based structure. They can produce, as it were, new examples that interpolate between existing data points without being directly traceable to any specific instance in the training set. In the sense that latent space is not merely a compressed replica of the training data, but a generative field of possibilities, one that ideally can account for cases not explicitly represented. And I'd like to pause on this point for a moment. We already heard the critique of the stochastic parrot as well as the metaphor of the blurry JPEG of the web. Both positions reject the idea that these models encode any model of the world itself, but at best the statistical distribution of statements about it. Right? They're language models, not world models, with all the distortions, redundancies, and omissions that such data entails. This position denies the validity of any communication without a subject and without modeling any context. In the words of Bender et al., language models are, quote, not grounded in communicative intent, any model of the world, or any model of the reader's state of mind. They are pure performance, to use Chomsky's term, without any competence. Apart from the more nuanced takes this position has invited from linguistics, philosophy, media studies, and literature, this dismissal is questioned by an increasingly vocal position from the industry, fed by successes in adjacent AI fields. That was also mentioned yesterday. OpenAI's text-to-video model, Sora, was presented with the accompanying claim that simply training on billions of videos creates a model that can simulate the physical laws of the world. Quote, our results suggest that scaling video generation is a promising path towards building general-purpose simulators of the physical world. This means that the model should be able to reconstruct implicit knowledge of the world simply by observing visual data, movements, material behavior, lighting conditions, and should be able to do so not by formulating a priori rules, but by inferring them from the abstractions produced in its compressed latent structure. The hope is that, if one could probe the model's internal representations, one would find not only microtemporal predictions of sequential states, but also something resembling kind of a formalization of gravity, inertia, fluid dynamics, etc. Indeed, the operational core of a comprehensive world model, a simulation, as it were. But that's not all. In Craig's original formulation, the concept of world model is not limited to guiding behavior in the physical world. It also includes the capacity to internally model social situations and other agents, the kind of model of the reader's state of mind, as Bender et al. Had put it, which encompasses human intentions, beliefs, and communicative context. In their most ambitious articulation, some AI researchers believe that this, too, is within reach. Consider Ilya Sutskever, co-founder of OpenAI, who has said of GPT-4 in a very bizarre interview that is online, quote, when we train a large neural network to accurately predict the next word in lots of different texts, it is learning a world model. The text is actually a projection of the world. What the neural network is learning is more and more aspects of the world, of people, of the human condition, their hopes, dreams, and motivations. The neural network learns a compressed, abstract, usable representation of that. Let me be clear, I'm not alone in very much doubting this, but as an aspiration and operative hypothesis, this hope is fueling some of the most expensive research done in this area. Thus understood, the most advanced machine learning systems would not merely be cohesion machines stitching together text unthinkingly, but would actually possess something like a world model, in the sophisticated sense of the world, not only calculating patterns, but also physical regularities and causality, not only linguistic distributions, but the logic of behavior, psychological motivation, and the relationships between implicit and explicit knowledge. World models that symbolic AI research has rejected as dead ends re-enter the latest AI models, at least in the minds of their inventors and, as it were, their salespeople, through to the back door as an effect of mere statistical training. I want to take a step back and maybe look at the theoretical implications here, again, completely speaking the subjunctive. The crucial thing about latent spaces is not that they map relations, but how. As Michael Gavin puts it, they model, quote, significant relationships to all other elements in the training data. A single entry is meaningless without its position in the system. Its semantic value is completely relational. For many observers, this relational structure has evoked a clear echo of structuralist linguistic theory, particularly the idea that meaning emerges not from reference, but from differential relations within a systems of science. We have heard this in different versions today. However, where the association with Saussure's idea of a differential system was still true, possibly for early embeddings, the famous example of king and queen is now outdated. Instead of fixed word vectors, current models with attention, as Tobias pointed out, generate so-called contextual embeddings that adjust dynamically based on the surrounding text, meaning that each token's representation is computed anew in context, allowing the model to capture subtle shifts in meaning, disambiguate homonyms, and reflect syntactic and semantic dependencies on the fly. The latent space is therefore not a store of fixed meanings, but maybe a dynamic space of possibilities. Only through the generation of an output is a concrete path drawn through the space, an actualization from the set of all conceivable connection possibilities. With this, one might ask whether a notion of word-level difference is still the most adequate description. Rather than invoking a Saussurean language system based on stable oppositions, one could turn, for instance, to Quine's semantic holism. Meaning arises not at the level of individual words, but at the level of sentences of propositions and within the broader web of beliefs that gives them coherence. In this view, each element derives its significance from its role in the larger inferential and epistemic network. And while it would be most likely an overstatement to say that latent spaces form coherent belief systems, they are certainly closer to this holistic view than earlier symbolically operating AI models. If latent spaces indeed form wholes, even if only incompletely and deficiently, then we could draw a remarkable similarity to the world claim of the novel. The philosopher Beatrice Fazzi, for instance, believes that what happens in language models is far more than the mere cobbling together of text fragments, as Bender et al. Suggest with their metaphor of the stochastic parrot. The central operation is indeed compression, but not as the blurred artifact-ridden JPEG that Chang spoke of as mere reduction, but as a holistic structuring. In the dimensional reduction that leads to the formation of the latent space, it is not simply a data shadow of language that emerges, but a new form of unity or wholeness, a synthetic, internally consistent entity. These wholes are self-contained configurations of meaning, not of the world, but of worldness. In a striking analogy to Blumenberg, Fazzi writes of, quote, the prospect that this representational reality, internal to the language model, could be a stable, if imperfect, whole, a togetherness of distributed representations, not the world, but as such, but a world. At Blumenberg, again, the novel is about not even just representing the world, but realizing a world, so worldness, as it were. The novel and the latent space are then not in a mimetic relationship to things, but in structural relationship to the worldness itself. They do not imitate the world, but the form of the world, its coherence, its transitions, its conditions of hanging together. What emerges in the latent space of language models is also a coherent structures of possible relations, a context of context, as one could say, a synthetic whole that, like the novel, does not reference the world, but constructively produces it. In the novel, too, as Blumenberg writes, quote, reality can no longer be a quality attached to given things, as it were, but the epitome of the unanimous perseverance of a syntax of elements, end quote. Both novel and language model make worldness possible as an effect of structure, of relation, of synthetic context, and as a space of possibility from which and within whose limits something new can be generated. I'm not saying that this is the case, and it probably isn't, but I think it is interesting to think about it. So if this were the case, one might ask why novels are connected, but this novel is only weakly connected. The obvious answer is that the wholes we are talking about are not so whole after all. As Fazzi put it, we are dealing with imperfect wholes, with diminished or fragmentary coherence, a quantitative reduction rather than a categorical difference. And despite the hype of OpenAI and others, even the latest AI systems still most likely do not have actual world models. But what is it then that makes them special? One idea might be this. According to Blumenberg, novels are indeed a world. But this ultimately means two things. On the one hand, they have a concrete content and thus represent a configuration, albeit fictional, of material givens. At the same time, however, they are always also a reflection on the structure itself, precisely as the context that is realized in time and through perspectives. In other words, they are material world and formal worldliness at the same time. One could tentatively argue that large language models separate the two, so that in extreme cases they represent worldness without a world, or possess only a minimum of world. I'm not going to go into the discussion about grounding, but I think one idea, at least that makes sense to me, is that there might be some kind of scale of this worldness, right? Not a binary, but a little bit of it. This idea is not completely far-fetched, I believe. In a relatively early analysis of LLM-generated literature, Matthew Kirschenbaum speaks of large language models as embodying a kind of fully activated formalism, form that is no longer materially constrained and whose manifestations have no necessary basis in a prior substance, such as experience or thought or reference, if you want to go that path. This does not mean that input or output are immaterial, nor does it mean solely that LLMs do not refer to things in the world, but, this is in line, I think, with Gianni, that the transformation of the generation of latent space, as Fazzi describes it as structuring, is a formalizing operation that completely disregards the context to which the input texts refer. Thus, the end result is only worldness, form, but no longer a concrete world, substance. Berlin-Miami can be read as an epistemic object that formalizes this condition, even if the concrete world has not entirely vanished, but merely receded, as it were. Here, too, Fletcher's idea of the absence of true narrative reasserts itself. The narrative trajectory traced through this nearly substance-free latent space, the epic structure that first renders a world perceptible to readers, can ultimately no longer sustain itself as a genuine narrative. This is perhaps unsurprising. Such trajectories always begin from the same initial condition, from a frozen world state, as it were, since no plot can leave a mark in the latent space once training is complete. The space itself is static, it does not evolve, and thus cannot register change, the very precondition of narrative. I'm coming to an end. In this talk, I have tried to use AI to think about the connection between the world and the novel, using my own novel as a material concept. It first became apparent that the idea of a world as a joint project of novel and AI parallels both endeavors in an at least interesting way. This parallelism merges into a convergence where LLMs themselves produce text, as in the case of Berlin, Miami, and both the novel and the latent space of language models can be understood as world-like wholes. This connection could be made primarily by asking about the exact nature of the connection that characterizes or distinguishes the two structures. The crucial difference, according to this thesis, which again I'm still working on it, is that novels exhibit both world and worldness, whereas LLMs only produce worldness without a world. This consideration is, as you realize, very speculative, and it is probably overstated. What is more, I'm not quite sure I would fully agree with Kirschenbaum's idea of an actual accomplished formalism, or whether intermediate stages are conceivable. One last thing. I do not want to end this talk by regarding my novel as deficient, but seeing it tentatively as a different kind of narrative text. And this is not only for reasons of vanity, but above all because synthetic language production will increase. It is only a matter of time before what I have produced as an experiment, albeit far more mature and with better models, becomes an actual consumer object. Such text will no doubt be much more coherent, but likely not entirely so. I therefore conclude with a still open question of whether texts like Berlin, Miami might constitute a distinct category of narrative literature in their own right. The first indication of what this category might entail can already be found in Blumenberg. For when reality is understood as a context to be realized, it is always threatened by the potential rupture of that context. The novel, which can only ever gesture towards its own endlessness, is subject to the same instability. Blumenberg therefore develops a fourth concept of reality, and is the second modern one, that of resistance. Here it is precisely that which undermines coherence and causality that is evidence of reality. Blumenberg sees this concept of reality already realized in modernist poetry and its obscurity, where the poem achieves its substance by, quote, annihilating the function of the means of meaning, end quote, through demonstrative inconsistency and paradox, and one might see a similar effect in the classical avant-gardes in Dada and Surrealism. However, the nature of their resistance differs fundamentally. Whereas Dadaists and Surrealists subvert bourgeois order by deliberately violating aesthetic and linguistic norms, the resistance of AI-generated texts emerges from the opposite direction, from an almost perfect statistical and formal regularity. In this sense, absurdist AI texts may indeed bear a family resemblance to earlier forms of literary absurdism, but their entirely different mode of production introduces, I think, a distinction that is at least worth thinking about. A second line of inquiry returns to Fletcher's insight. If causality is indeed a necessary condition for narrative, and it might not be, then we might ask what its partial or complete absence implies for the notion of world. Here, Canton Meillassoux' concept of extra science fiction becomes useful, a form of fiction in which causality itself is visibly suspended, where the laws of nature are no longer stable or knowable. For Meillassoux, crucially, the absence of causal order is not a binary condition, but exists on a spectrum. Among literary genres, science fiction is perhaps the most explicitly invested in causality, as it transforms scientific explanation into a narrative device. The world it constructs may differ radically from our own, but it must remain causally intelligible. These are still, in his words, ordered totalities. This principle, of course, extends to most conventional novels as well, even if their adherence to physical causality is less overt. It often functions, as Eco had noted, as one of those unspoken presuppositions that make the narrative legible in the first place. The worlds of extra science fiction, on the other hand, according to Meillassoux, are, quote, not subject to necessary laws. Their worlds are unstable, capable here or there of absurd behavior, but regular on the whole, although their regularity does not result in any way from necessary causal processes. He now names 3 types of such non-causal, only semi-causal worlds, of which the last 2 are maybe the most important here. An extra science fiction world of what Meillassoux calls type 2 is largely governed by regular laws, yet it periodically lapses into inconsistency. Events swerve off the road, as he puts it, remaining stubbornly unexplained and inexplicable. It is, as he puts it, a reality whose margin would become capricious. Finally, a type 3 world in Meillassoux' schema is one in which all necessity and regularity has vanished. Such a world would border on the incomprehensible, even the unthinkable. For in the total absence of causality, no stable patterns could emerge, and thus no recognizably ordered experience could arise. And of course, this is on the context of, as it were, narration, not on the ordering of tokens or words. It would be a reality without laws beyond the reach of narrative, inference, or understanding. Literary AI texts, assuming that the problem of causality remains unresolved, seem to belong more to Meillassoux' second type than the third. This is why they remain, at least in part, intelligible. I can still read and make sense of them, even if doing so is unsettling and demands considerable interpretive effort. Though produced by technical regularity, the narrative worldness generated by the AI model aligns with the logic of extra science fiction, a world that is largely coherent but punctuated by inexplicable swerves, or maybe more than a world of this type. It is here that the paths of aesthetic and technical ambition begin to diverge. For AI research, if one takes Sutskever and his colleagues at their word, this is not enough. The goal is not merely to approximate world-likeness, but to steer outputs towards the realm of real science fiction, as it were, text grounded in a complete and operative world model. Not just a world, but the world, as it were. Thank you very much.